So here in this unit, we talk about the most important theory in biology, evolution. Evolution is the concept that species have changed over time. It's been a very controversial concept. Some people today believe it, other people don't. Most people today, for example, believe in the germ theory of disease. That was first proposed in the late 1800s, not long after Darwin's theory of evolution. Most people do not discount the germ theory of disease. Most people think that if they go to their doctor and they get some antibiotics, they'll get better if they're ill. But evolutionary theory, which is actually simpler in terms of explanation than germ theory, is not as widely believed. Concepts of evolution actually were cropping up in the 1700s. Biologists began to realize that bone anatomy of radically different mammals had peculiar similarities, which seemed to indicate a certain type of relatedness. And by the early 1800s, Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, in 1809, published an evolutionary theory which turned out to be incorrect, but it was a step in the direction of trying to explain why animals like whales have hands in their flippers. So what Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck proposed was a simple evolutionary theory based on three principles. All organisms have a desire to change, which is debatable, but what he implied was that all organisms want to change and adapt to their surroundings. Secondly, adaptations are subject to the laws of use and disuse, so that if you have a hand that's good for grasping and you use your hand a lot, it'll get stronger and better at what it's doing. And if you don't use your hand ever, the muscles will thin out and it'll atrophy and it will become less able to grasp things and be able to be used as a tool. That actually is a true statement. Now, the third thing, which we used to think was incorrect, but now actually we found that it's partially correct. Lamarck proposed that organisms inherited their parents' acquired characteristics over their lifetime. So if you if as a life form you developed super strong arms because you were using your arms all the time, your offspring would simply have better developed arms right off the bat because of your hyper developed arms. People tested the theory repeatedly, and they found that statement 1 and statement 3 could not be supported. So this ended up being a theory that did not adequately explain why all the vertebrates share a common bone anatomy, but it was a step in that direction. Then comes on the scene Charles Darwin. He was born the year that Lamarck published his theory. Darwin was born in 1809. He died in 1882. Here he is in his younger days, and here he is in his older days later in life. And here is one of his sketches of an evolutionary tree, the first that had ever been produced, as far as we can tell, in the history of mankind. Darwin was born a member of a wealthy family. His parents wanted him to be a physician. His grandfather was physician to the king. The family was well connected. They owned a huge estate. They did not have to work. They had peasants working for them. Darwin was disenfranchised with medicine. He did not want to be a doctor, so his dad and his grandpa helped to get him appointed as a ship's naturalist. That's the biologist on a ship. On the HMS Beagle, that was a naval vessel that was sailing around the world for the purpose of mapping, because those who have the best maps can own the most property. So it's a long trip, though, for 5 years. You'll notice he sailed from England south along the west coast of Africa, and then reached the east coast of South America, and then they mapped the east coast of South America carefully. They went by the Falkland Islands. They went round the Horn of South America, and they came up the west coast. And then once they reached the northern regions of South America, they sailed west and encountered the Galapagos Islands. From there, they sailed west across the Pacific and encountered New Zealand and Australia. And from there, they sailed around the south side of Australia through the southern Indian Ocean and then around the Horn of Africa and then back to the west coast of South America. And from there, they then sailed back north to England. So Darwin found very strange species of plants and animals on the trip, and the strangest species were always on islands. The island species were always similar to species that were on the nearest continent, but they were always somehow different in color, in texture, or something. He discovered fossils also that were transitional versions between what he found on continents and what he found on islands. And the species that he found that were endemic on the islands were always adapted in some way, shape, or form to their peculiar island environment. So, from this experience, he began to think about two important ideas: that many organisms on Earth may have been derived from a single ancestral species by a process that he called common descent, and then, secondly, the idea that a process where a species over many generations of reproduction could adapt to its environment through the crucible of a process of natural selection. He called this adaptation. So his concept now that was growing in his head that he was developing, which was contradictory to the story in the Bible of the creation of life on Earth and the creation of Earth, was that organisms descended from a common ancestor, but they became different through a process of adaptation. Darwin returned from the voyage in the mid-1830s. He thought about these ideas for 20 years and finally published a book, The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, in 1859. And it became the most controversial science book in the history of science. Things that influenced Darwin's concept of natural selection and his theory of evolution. First, James Hutton introduced the concept that the Earth was very slow, or the Earth was the product, the current state of the Earth was a product of very slow and geologically, minutely, painstakingly slow processes that happened very gradually over time. So James Hutton is known as the father of modern geology. He looked at rock layers like what you see on exposed hillsides, and he began to try and explain those layers of rock, not in terms of a creation process, but where sediment was deposited there over the millennia very slowly and created the many layers of rock that were found in the hillside layer. Less than 100 years later, Charles Lyell wrote a critically important book for Darwin that he had on his voyage, Principles of Geology, which explained that the Earth must be very old because based on the time it takes to lay down all of these layers, the Earth is at least hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years old. Now, again, this contradicts what the Bible was saying, but science is just looking at what's out there and trying to figure out how it got there. Darwin also had evidence of artificial selection from farmers. He knew that farmers routinely selected breeding animals and selectively crossed plants and produced better crop varieties in doing so. And they've been doing this to cows, pigs, horses, and peas and everything else for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And as a result, had produced many different varieties of these agricultural products. Darwin figured that, if farmers could do this to species over fairly human lifetime, short periods of time, then why couldn't nature change species over very long periods of time? Thomas Malthus was a fourth contributor in the late 1700s. He wrote an essay on overpopulation, which basically gave Darwin the concept that populations grow exponentially, meaning that instead of adding a standard amount of babies every year to a population, organisms tend to grow exponentially, meaning they add more babies proportionately every year to a population, and that's because females do not reproduce once in a lifetime, and they reproduce multiple times, sometimes even within a season. On the other hand, food supplies only grow arithmetically, which brings up the conundrum: if life forms are growing exponentially, but their food is not keeping up, you have a problem of starvation and competition. And that gave Darwin the concept of the struggle for existence. So Darwin's theory, in a summary, is right here in these 5 statements. Individual organisms differ, and some of the variation is inherited. So he recognized that not all zebras are the same, and not only are they not the same, their differences are inherited. Now, he had a problem with this statement. At the time Darwin published his book, biology believed in blending inheritance, which was totally incorrect. Shortly after Darwin published his book, Gregor Mendel, an Austrian monk, published a brand new genetics theory, but nobody bought into it, and Darwin never got to read it. And as a result, people discounted Darwin's theory of evolution for more than 30 years because of statement number one. And it wasn't until the turn of the 20th century and Gregor Mendel's work was rediscovered as correct that no one could refute then Darwin's theory on statement number one. So organisms are different, and their differences were inherited from their parents, and they can pass those to their kids. Secondly, organisms produce more offspring than can possibly survive. Darwin is one of the first to recognize this. Frogs lay thousands of eggs, and yes, less than a handful actually survive more than 2 years. And so that implies there's a large struggle for existence going on across the planet. Now, because more organisms are produced than can survive, they compete for those limited resources. And because of excess reproduction, there's a struggle for existence, as I said before, and there's intense competition between members of a species. Some individuals are going to die, and other individuals are going to win and survive. The erroneous phrase survival of the fittest is often used to summarize this, but the fittest don't just survive, the fittest reproduce. So please do not use the phrase survival of the fittest to describe any of Darwin's statements. It's actually reproduction of the fittest is how the theory works. Most critical to the theory is statement 4. Individuals best suited to their environment survive and successfully reproduce the most fit offspring. Other organisms less suited die or leave fewer, less fit offspring. And what that means is that over time, because some organisms are getting killed and others are surviving, the survivors are contributing to the features of the future. And the ones that died, those features are lost. And so that's why over time, populations change. It's because there's differential survival and reproduction. So this life and death processes causes species to change over time. Fitness describes reproductive success. Basically, organisms that have a perfect reproductive fitness are described to have a fitness with a number 1. That means that they're going to survive, they're going to reproduce, and they're going to have fit offspring that will survive and reproduce. And if you are an organism that you're not well suited to your environment, well, then you don't successfully reproduce because maybe you die before you can, or you don't pick a mate properly. And as a result, you cannot successfully produce offspring. Then your fitness is 0. If you contribute no chromosomes to a future generation, your fitness is described as 0. The last statement, which sums this up then, is species alive today descended with modifications from ancestors in the distant past. This theory is still very controversial today, but it is a very simple concept that because all organisms are different and the playing field is not even, some organisms are going to survive and they're going to contribute to the future, and other organisms are not going to survive and they're not going to contribute to the future. Now, take a look at this simple animation. So let's play a game here. We've got a little rabbit. It's jumping around, and it's a white rabbit, and it's on a brown landscape. It's not adapted to the landscape. We got to add a friend or the bunny will die. Now, rabbits, there's nothing inappropriate here, but the rabbits are actually going to reproduce, and they're hopping around, and they're making babies, and there's lots of white rabbits now hopping around on a brown landscape. But in all environments, there are predators. If we add a predator to this environment, the rabbits don't stand a chance. They're all white. Now, the wolves will eventually wipe them all out and they'll become extinct. Now, if we add a mutation for brown fur, the brown rabbits should be able to hide and survive and reproduce. If the mutation comes in time, they'll survive. Not all species get a mutation in time. Aha, we have a few brown rabbits. The wolves are now running around and they're eating the white rabbits, but the brown rabbits see one brown rabbit died, but proportionately that's only 50%, more than 50% of the white rabbits died. Now there's more brown rabbits. Here come the wolves. They'll eat a few of the brown rabbits, but they'll get mostly white rabbits. Now we have only one white rabbit left, and we have lots of brown rabbits. So you can see the population has changed from primarily a white bunny population to a brown bunny population because the rabbits were different. And the predators wipe out one variety more than another simply because usually one variety has a peculiar nature to it that's easier for the predator to catch. So if you play this game to the end, a lot of times the white rabbit will end up disappearing. Sometimes not. And the brown rabbits eventually may take over the world if the wolves don't actually take out enough of the brown rabbits. The point is now, if we change the landscape to Arctic, let's just suppose now that this brown landscape becomes, over time, geologic change, a snowy white landscape. The wolves move in, and now they can see the brown rabbits, but they can't see the white rabbits. So now the population starts to evolve, go backwards the other way. The brown rabbits start disappearing, the white rabbits start coming back. This is how evolution works. It's differential survival and reproduction. So now the wolves are wiping out the brown varieties, leaving the white varieties, and after a few rounds of predator-prey interaction and reproduction, we're going to end up with more white rabbits than brown rabbits. Here come the wolves again, and they're wiping out the brown rabbits now. And now we end up with about the same number of brown and white rabbits at this point. Another couple of rounds of predator-prey interaction and reproduction, and we're going to end up with more white rabbits than brown rabbits. The key is that Earth has not always been the same. Missouri used to be a coniferous forest. Sequoias used to grow in the state of Missouri. We were much colder 10,000 years ago than we are today. Climate changes, and when the climate changes, this is what happens. Organisms either adapt or they become extinct. So now you notice that the white rabbits are outnumbering the brown rabbits, and the wolves are coming in and they're eating mostly the browns. So you've seen enough of the game, but I thought I would just let you see a kind of an animation. You can play this game if you click here, click on the natural selection link right here, and then download the game. When you click on the natural selection link, you'll come here, click download. And when you do that, launch the downloaded file, and you can go ahead and play the game yourself. It basically emphasizes the very simple concept that not everybody is built the same, and reproduction is not fair. Life is not fair. And that's what evolution by natural selection is all about. Life is not fair. And because life is not fair, some things are advantaged over others. And unlike the Bill of Rights, where all men are created equal, all life forms are not created equal. Some are intrinsically better to surviving than others. But what works today for a group of life forms may not work tomorrow. And so just because a set of mutations makes just because you and your family is better today doesn't mean that 5 generations down the road that's going to be true. So I want to emphasize, I'm going to go back now to the notes, just because something works now doesn't mean it's going to work later. When the environment changes, what didn't work before may work better then. So it is always important to have a diverse population, because with a diverse population, chances are there's always some life forms that will exist no matter how the environment changes, and there will be survivors, and species then will continue on. If the environment changes and all life forms cannot adapt, there are no variations in the population, they become extinct. And extinction is the name of the game on planet Earth. We've had massive extinctions in the past, and it's pretty obvious from the fossil record, more than 99% of all species that have ever popped up on planet Earth are now gone. And we, the ones that are still alive, are the survivors, because in our ancestral lineage, there was enough genetic variation in the population to survive, however the environment changed. So next, after this, I'll move into population genetics.